Good morning. Welcome to this latest of our webinar colloquia on various issues in procurement. My name is Chris Eukins. I'm a professor at George Washington University Law School. I'm the Lynn David Research Professor in Government Procurement Law in our Government Procurement Law program. Just a few administrative details. The information for today's webinar is available at publicprocurementinternational.com, and the recording from today's session will be posted later today. Dean Tiltman and I will be posting it on the YouTube page for the GW Law Government Procurement Law program, and also on the program page of Public Procurement International. We have, if you could, along the way, if you can ask questions in the chat, that'd be great. We'll be responding to those. I should emphasize that the speaker statements today are in their personal capacities. And just a quick note on an upcoming program, there is a June 8th session on the Fat Leonard scandal, which is a major scandal that has shaken certainly the military establishment here, in terms of there were bribes given in the Western Pacific by a character who's referred to colloquially as Fat Leonard. Steve Schooner will be talking about a new book on that on June 8th. And the information is on our Beyond the FAR program page, and the references here to that website. Just for today's agenda, I'm going to go through the introductions. Then we're going to talk a little bit about options in green procurement, drawing on some research that Steve Schooner has published. We're going to review the core of today's program, which is the EU-US Catalog on green procurement strategies. I'll talk very briefly about the US rule on green procurement, the new one that's just published. And we're going to assess strategies. We're going to have a deep dive by Lucian Sonat. We're going to have a deep dive by Kate Silos and also by Gianluigi Albano, talking about different strategies. And we'll close out with questions and discussion. So we're joined today by Kate Silos, who's the Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for World Trade Organization and Multilateral Affairs at the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative here in Washington. Lucian Sonat, who's the Head of Global Regulatory Cooperation and International Procurement Negotiations at the European Commission. Thank you for joining us as well. And Gianluigi Albano, who's joining us from Rome. He's the head of the division at CONSIP, which is the centralized purchasing agency for Italy. It's the national central purchasing body located in Rome. He's also a research fellow at Utrecht University Center for Public Procurement and an adjunct professor of economics at Luis, the university in Rome. Okay, so what Steve Schooner did and what we'll be focusing on today is 5 different strategies for dealing with green procurement. How do we drive forward environmental sustainability? We can use planning strategies where during the planning process, there would be an encouragement for the use of green technologies to encourage environmental sustainability. We can look at contractor qualification. We'll be talking about a proposed U.S. rule, which would say that major contractors that don't have not chronicled or cannot chronicle the greenhouse gas emissions will not be responsible or qualified. We can use eco labels, which is a label that specifies or it signifies that a product or service meets certain standards. You can, in the technical evaluation process, you can weigh the pros and cons of some products, for instance, maybe greener, maybe better in terms of environmental sustainability, and weigh that against those that are worse. Finally, you can use life cycle cost analysis. You can figure out, okay, over the life cycle of this product, how much will it cost to deal with it if it is not, in fact, a sustainable product? Now, in dealing with these 5 different strategies, the joint catalog that we're focusing on today, the joint US-EU catalog of best practices on green public procurement, which is available on the program site of Public Procurement International, it reflects a common understanding between the EU and the US. It's really a breakthrough document because it makes it clear internationally that there are common strategies on both sides of the Atlantic. Marta Andolf and I wrote about this in a piece earlier before this came out, but the catalog goes so much further because it really brings, in a very clear way, brings out these common strategies on both sides of the Atlantic. The idea that public procurement grounded in environmental sustainability can contribute to achieving shared environmental goals in different countries. And in the United States, with the Biden administration, the term is catalyzed, that the government's actions to advance green public procurement can catalyze sustainability in the broader marketplace because of the very important role that governments play in any given marketplace. Now, the catalog was published as part of the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, and it came out of the sixth ministerial meeting, which was held in April. And as you can see from the attendees, it's a very high-level meeting between the European Union and the United States government. And the EU-US Trade and Technology Council provides a forum for the US and the European Union to coordinate approaches to key global trade, economic, and technology issues. And I want to emphasize the council here just because it's going to be an important focus, I think, in the future for sustainability efforts of this kind. I just very quickly want to touch on a new rule on green procurement that was published after the catalog was published. On April 22 in the Federal Register, there was a new rule published. It's a long rule. It's about 40 pages in the Federal Register. So I just want to give it a very quick distillation here. It sets up a new clause, FAR 52.223-23, that will require agencies to procure sustainable products and services to the maximum extent practicable. It applies to all procurements, including micro purchases. It does not, though, apply to weapon systems or to contracts performed abroad. It requires the purchasing agency to list the required sustainable products and services in solicitation. So it's decentralizing the process a great deal to the requiring agencies, leaving it to them to publish that list. The agency may decide not to require sustainable goods and services. They have to produce a written justification because the price isn't reasonable, or it would impact performance, and it could impact things like Buy American requirements. Those would supersede the green procurement requirements, or because the sustainable procurement requirements would impact the schedule, make it not a reasonable schedule. The requiring agency not only lists what it wants in terms of green products or services, but it also evaluates. So it makes a decision whether or not the green procurement standards will be part of the evaluation, and it enforces. A backdrop here for our colleagues from abroad is that while the agency has first authority to enforce, the False Claims Act is always looming in the background for American contractors. So if there are green products called for and green products are not delivered, there's going to be a potential issue in fraud under the False Claims Act as well. The rule sets up a relatively narrow definition of sustainable products and services. It channels into the EPA's, the Environmental Protection Agency's, list of eco labels and recommended products. And that list is frozen as of October 2023. So the EPA list is interesting because it may create a choke point because it only lists, for example, 40 eco labels, and also the standards. It creates potentially interesting trade issue because the standards that the EPA applies, what it uses in bringing an eco label in, those standards are not as rigorous as we see in the European Union. Under the Max Havelaar case, as was implemented in the European directive, the standards or the rules for the rules, how will the EPA adopt a particular eco label, for example? That's not as rigorous and as open as what's called for by the European Union under the Directive 2014/24/EU. The eco label standards incorporate the Max Havelaar decision in the Court of Justice for the European Union. And those are very, very thoughtful. It's a very thoughtful approach from the Court of Justice for the European Union regarding eco labels, different here with the EPA standards. So that may be an interesting future trade issue. Okay, we talked already about the new rule, and we can compare that to how the EU is approaching it in terms of planning. The EU leaves, as we see from the catalog, the EU leaves a lot to member states' national action plans. So a different approach to planning issues, contractor qualification. We talked about the US approach. Under the EU approach, the vendors can be excluded if they violate environmental requirements. There's a proposed rule in the United States that would require, as I said, major vendors to identify their greenhouse gas emissions for goods and services. That rule, however, was stalled by the National Defense Authorization Act for fiscal year 2024. Section 318 said that it barred the Defense Department from gathering that data from contractors. So, effectively, it stalled that proposed rule, and it's not clear how that rule will roll forward. The eco labels we talked about briefly already. Technical evaluations. We can see in the EU, and the catalog talks about examples in the EU where member states are actually bringing in green procurement standards into their technical evaluations. A very interesting next step. The United States is not there yet. That's part of the reason that there's a requirement for for vendors to chronicle greenhouse gas emissions, because when they can produce those on a commercially sound basis, then that data can be used in technical evaluations. The last is life cycle costs. Well, the EU has a life cycle costing tool. The United States still doesn't require it as part of the new rule. And it's important because life cycle cost analysis itself can be a barrier to trade, because if life cycle cost analysis is done in one way, it may exclude other vendors. So it's an interesting trade issue as well. So I just want to ask a couple questions for the panel. I could stop rambling on here. How was the joint catalog? This is primarily for Luciana and for Kate. How was the joint catalog developed?
Sure. So over the course of, I guess, about a year and a half, we had, I want to say, maybe 10 or 12 information sharing sessions between different government officials focused on kinds of green procurement. So EPA, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and kind of their counterparts in the EU to discuss some of the specific policies that have been put in place, also kind of cataloging some of the, very new policies. And over the course of, those months, there were new policies being introduced all the time. Just as you mentioned, once we finally published the best practices, right after that, there was this new rule that we knew, was coming out, and you can only kind of hold these back so long. But there was a lot of just information sharing on, here's the policies that have been put forward, and here's what they mean. I think even without the catalog that we developed for use by other people, a lot of those information sharing sessions were really helpful, because it was just kind of government to government understanding how we actually use these things in procurement.
Yes, maybe very briefly on my side to explain a bit the European side of the common effort that went into the preparation of the joint catalog. We at the European Commission, we have different directorates general with expertise or direct involvement in the implementation of our rules on public procurement, but also on environmental issues. And we brought together that expertise from across our services and experts, and we shared our proposals with our American colleagues, and together we distilled what indeed looked as coherent and practices and examples that would lead towards this common objective that we share, I think, in climate change. So I would with this also like to thank all the colleagues that were heavily involved through so many meetings, and there was a tremendous effort put into the preparation of the catalog on our side as well.
For both of you, one of the major concerns in the U.S. procurement community has to do with cybersecurity. I'm going to use the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC. It's now in the 2.0 stage, and it's being developed by the Defense Department, but this cybersecurity standard is likely to be used across the government. And it's actually gotten very good. In 2.0, it is a holistic approach, bringing in various standards from the National Institutes for Standards and Technology to bring together a layered approach to cybersecurity for contractors. And there are obviously shared security interests across the Atlantic. CMMC, though, this is it. It builds on American standards, NIST standards, the National Institutes for Standards and Technology. And those aren't necessarily, certainly, probably aren't the standards that will be followed by a European vendor that might have a really good information technology solution that could be used in the US market. The Defense Department has set up an ad hoc process for listening to the European vendors and saying, oh, your cybersecurity standards are as good. But that ad hoc process through the DoD's chief information officer, the CIO, is not as good as some sort of regulatory cooperation. Will it be possible to take this wonderful model that you've used for environmental sustainability and also apply it in other areas like cybersecurity?
I'm happy to weigh in first. I think this model probably could be used for cybersecurity or a number of other, procurement issues that we can work on. I think, on that point, we have had some information sharing sessions with NIST to talk about like the FedRAMP program and some of the kind of best practices there, and understanding what is it that the US does, what is it that the EU does. Is there some way that we can cooperate and make sure that we're looking at it in the same way? And so sometimes starting with a catalog of, you know, what the policies are and best practices is an easy way to try and encourage cooperation. And I think, you know, certainly for cybersecurity or a number of issues that would be possible.
Yes, likewise on my side, Chris, I think indeed it is only logical to ask ourselves, where else can we apply this regulatory cooperation model? On what other new and emerging requirements that public authorities have for their goods and services, and what can we do across the Atlantic to facilitate cross-border international procurement? Now, cybersecurity clearly comes to mind as a major requirement that will apply in the future to more and more products and services, but at the same time, it's also somewhat different, I think, from the environmental best practices we put together. When it comes to climate change, this is a multifaceted, highly complex, different products having to do with many other aspects of those products, and the requirements can be very different. Now, cybersecurity is sometimes much more targeted. It's perhaps even binary. It's either safe or not safe. It's secure or not secure, and it usually requires some sort of certification, which is not always the case for green procurement. Whereas in cybersecurity, if it's a mandatory certification, even if we have different standards, I think the way forward would be for us to facilitate the granting of cyber certification across the Atlantic in a way that does not become a trade barrier.
If I may, Chris, about this final, I just want to sort of, even if possible, strengthen what Lucian has just said. I mean, the major difference that I can see is that cybersecurity relates to such a, I would say, extremely sensitive area, so that regulation becomes sort of the almost compulsory way of approaching it. So, and if it's a 0-1, I'm using exactly expression Lucian has used, means that there is no way of measuring a trade-off. You mentioned, Chris, the possibility when it comes to green standards to evaluate costs versus, you know, the additional cost versus the potential benefits of greener solutions. But this trade-off is in a way ruled out in a cybersecurity world. So it's either something is safe or it's not. There is no way you're going to trade off, you know, a little bit less of security for having a cheaper, you know, for saving money. I mean, that's the point. It's the most dramatic form of regulation, which makes it, to me, a little bit more sophisticated in terms of international negotiations, because you may want to, you know, may want one side of the ocean going for one level and the other side for another level. But at the same time, once you reach an agreement, it becomes kind of much more clear, because it's there and there is no compromise. There is no way of trading off, you know, cost and benefit. So it's more difficult and easier at the same time.
Thanks very much, Gianluigi. So we have a couple folks who raise their hands. If you could put your questions in the chat, we're going to try to gather those questions for the end. And just a quick, we were joking about this before for our audience, and we have folks from 70 different countries around the world, many of whom, ironically, Kate, are actually former students. And they'll be amused to know that I think there's consensus in the panel that if you were going to compare this stuff to a PhD dissertation, this is like chapter 2 in a PhD dissertation. The catalog is a literature review. And as anybody who's ever suffered through a PhD dissertation, Gianluigi is nodding, anyone's ever suffered through a PhD dissertation, that literature review is actually incredibly important because it sets the foundation for future progress through the dissertation. So with that, Luciano, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll go ahead and advance the slides at your request.
Many thanks, Chris. And maybe just to bounce back on your last comment, I still remember the pains of the literature review for my PhD, but I also remember quite vividly what my supervisors at the time told me, which was that, well done, this is a very good literature review, but you will not get your PhD just based on a literature review. That's clearly far short of what is expected. So I think that's also, if I can jump to one of my key concluding remarks, this is a very, very good start, but by no means the end of a potential and the possibilities that we have ahead of us in our transatlantic cooperation. So just to give the audience a sense of proportions and the real need for us to jointly consider the possibilities of enhancing green procurement, let's start with what I call the $9 trillion challenge. And in the next slide, you will see what I mean by this. Different estimates may vary, but I think the conclusion is the same. If we were to look at the imperative of climate transition that we as humanity have in front of us, the challenge is immense. This particular estimate here that I use to illustrate my point points to a shortage of $9 trillion at global level. This is what would be required in this estimate for us to stay on path and to reach the kind of greening of our economies that will make our planet safe from a climate perspective. And as you can see, by now, we are very far behind. What is currently being invested now, this requires major investment. So there are many aspects of that. It could be public spending or private spending. If you compare the level of current investment at global level that went already into greening our economies with the size of the EU procurement market, which I added to that chart as a blue bar, the EU procurement market is estimated at about 2 trillion euros annually. That would be, if we manage to green public procurement in Europe to the maximum extent possible, we would probably more than double the current level of climate spending that has taken place already at global level. So it is a major challenge ahead of us, but this also shows the major potential that public procurement in Europe and elsewhere has as a driver, a major driver for achieving these climate objectives. In our case, would be the equivalent of greening roughly 14% of EU GDP. Why is green procurement so important? Well, because it can lead to direct positive effects on environment by every time we buy goods and services or infrastructure that are environmentally sustainable, we make that positive contribution. But I think even more so in an indirect manner, we have a huge market leverage that would encourage companies to invest in such products when they sell to public authorities. And once they make that investment, now they can deploy the products to also the private sector as well. So you green more than just what you buy yourself. So there's a multiplier effect of public spending on green procurement. Next slide, please. Now, and here I'm already getting into some of the elements that went into the preparation of the joint catalog on our side, and I'm sure Kate will have more to add to that. Essentially, for us, when we looked at what could become part of this joint catalog of best practices, we had to look at many aspects, not just the laws and the regulations and the rules, but also the way in which member states implement the European rules. So at the European level, by and large, green public procurement criteria or requirements are still as a set of voluntary requirements. We have a voluntary green procurement criteria. We have these national plans that you mentioned as well, Chris. So there are many, many instruments through which we try to encourage the adoption of green public procurement. Then you have national authorities that they have their own laws, and some of our member states have mandatory requirements in their laws. And now, most recently, we also have examples of new European legislations that have an impact on green public procurement. And here we have now mandatory requirements. So some examples are the Clean Vehicle Directive, the Net Zero Industry Act, or the regulation on eco-design for sustainable products. Next. Now, as you very well illustrated, Chris, when we group these best practices by the various stages of public procurement, we found examples across the board. So we have At the pre-procurement stage, for instance, significant investment in R&D solutions that would facilitate the deployment of new technologies that have this climate change potential beyond public procurement. So public procurement can, in fact, stimulate innovation. We have innovation procurement. There's an example about us funding, for instance, carbon capture and storage facilities as part of procurement activities. Then you have this strategic planning stage where national action plans in many countries, as I said, have introduced already mandatory rules. Transport is a sector that is significantly important, I think, for public procurement. So we have new criteria, new requirements here on transport and clean vehicles. And then you have the procurement stage with the criteria, as we mentioned as well, the use of eco design and energy labels, which I think it's indeed extremely one of the most important aspects of our conversation would be eco labels. And then post-contract award, where we in Europe try to introduce key performance indicators for suppliers. And that would be already part of contract performance and the verification mechanisms. And in certain cases, we will also have third-party audits. So in a way, we're now already have a good idea of the key, in my view, the key elements to ensure a strong impetus on green procurement, eco-labeling, and third-party certification. So these are some of the few examples I filtered. I think there's a wealth of information in the joint catalog. We don't have the time to go through all of them here. And I would now like to move to our transatlantic efforts. What can we do together? So again, just to remind ourselves why it's absolutely crucial for us to join our minds and our actions and try to come up with more efficient common solutions. We have a major gap in our efforts, despite all the existing instruments, despite IRA, despite everything else we try to do with the Green Deal in Europe. If you take two crucial technologies for our climate transition, wind and solar, you will see that according to some estimates we have in the United States, for instance, more than half of the required needs for wind are not met. Similarly, in the EU, we have 58% gap in wind technologies. In solar technology, we are a little bit better, but still having a 40% gap from what is estimated to be required for our clean transition. That's not a small gap. How can we together then use public procurement to fill those gaps? And I think to that end, the joint catalog shows the way by prompting us to think harder and probably coming up with more tangible solutions on some of these aspects. So if we were to move to the next slide. Yes, I think this we can skip. We already discussed how we came up with the catalog. I think, as I said, it was a tremendous effort, perhaps unprecedented in a sense, because we started from no common basis, and we had to discover by looking at what we have in our rule book elements that would give us a common platform. And the good news is that if you see the catalog, there is a very solid common ground for us to move to our next level in our cooperation. And this next level of cooperation is already mandated either by political imperatives in the US context. Here I just selected one example of US priorities where Congress indicated priorities for USTR in working with allies and European counterparts on a lot of things, including on, I think, on climate-related technologies. We have examples of such common priorities also in the joint statements of the Trade and Technology Council that was, as you said, held at the highest political level. So the commitment is there. I think the commitment and the objectives are shared by the two parties. Now, how can we, in fact, materialize this common objective? So I think in the next slide, I have some tentative ideas or suggestions. So to recap, given the huge financing gap, given the fact that in order to promote climate-related technology, we need to reduce the cost of procurement, we need to facilitate green procurement. For that, we will need trade facilitation as well. No country is an island. Nobody can produce by themselves everything they need. So we will need engagement, and we need to ensure that we trust each other when we engage in such technologies. For that, we would need common, verifiable, and ambitious environmental criteria for green procurement. There is a risk of greenwashing, so we need to ensure whenever we buy green, we have in the box what's written on the label, and these are there are some ways in which we can ensure that. Eco-labeling is a tested solution. We had until recently a working mutual recognition agreement between EU and US on eco-labeling. We recognize each other's eco-labels. Unfortunately, that MRA, that mutual recognition agreement, expired in 2018. And we have a well-functioning mutual recognition agreement between EU and the US, which covers several products. We could perhaps expand the scope of that MRA if we wanted to promote green procurement by including the kind of technologies that we both need to purchase with the best specifications and with the lowest cost possible. So I would leave it at this, Chris, and once again, many thanks for organizing this event.
Thank you very much. So we got a question in the chat. And you know, the old lawyers joke, Jen, you never ask a question that you don't know the answer. Well, I know the answer to this question, which is you can't answer. The question we got in the chat was, are there going to be mandatory green procurement requirements in the new directive? And that's not appropriate for you to answer because it's not your job. So I'm going to ask Gianluigi. Gianluigi, will there be
I guess
will there be mandatory green procurement requirements?
I guess you're referring to Sandeep's question about trading off costs and benefits.
No, actually, there was a question. So we got a question from Aline. Is Rovan, and I hope I got that pronunciation correct, asking specifically whether or not we think that the new directive, if there's a new European procurement directive, will it include mandatory green procurement requirements?
The point is that mandatory. I'm sorry. I'm just going to give you an appetizer of my slides. The point is mandatory is really, it's something that emphasizes the role of regulation in this. So at some point, a kind of regulatory approach is needed in order to make the message as consistent and strong as possible. Now there is a cost to be paid in the short term that I will sort of take on my presentation. But I think that without using this as sort of the stick, you may leave too much, I would say, freedom, too much heterogeneity in the market. And so these jointly with demand fragmentation in public procurement market may make the entire, challenge a little bit more, I would say, blunt, in sense, not effective as we wish. All I'm saying is that we need to send strong signals, and regulation, to some extent, is a way of sending strong signals to the market. Okay, that's a short version of my answer.
Hey, you're seeing the miracle of what Gianluigi did when we were in New Orleans. He was actually explaining to state procurement lawyers from across the United States that an economist can predict the law. It's amazing. It's actually usually right. I'm going to turn over to you.
Thanks. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of some of the kind of big things that were highlighted in the creation of this catalog, and we can move to the next slide. And first was just some of the big challenges that we saw in green procurement, and that really were featured in our discussions of talking about the different policies and regulations that we had in place. And, the biggest challenge overall, I think, as some of these new green, certifications, green regulations are put in place, is the training of procurement professionals, because a lot of times these, mandates and certifying what is actually being procured falls to someone that does not, have any kind of specialty in sustainable products. And as you see more of these green procurement regulations not being voluntary and being mandated, they're government-wide. They're across all different kinds of agencies. And so whether, they're procuring simple things or complex things that are in technical specifications, having to know what exactly to put in there, having to know how to distinguish between the different competitive offers, that's a challenge that falls to procurement professionals. And, that's something that you're going to see challenges at the state and federal level. But certainly, when in our discussions with our EU counterparts, we found, that this is something that in many cases the eco labels or some of those things can help with, but we are going to see that as a challenge moving forward. And then similarly, ensuring compliance with these new green procurement regulations when they are no longer voluntary. And oftentimes you are seeing contractors self-certifying some elements of compliance. If it's not them just, having an eco label, and having to ensure that, as this is more commonplace, that they're not met with protests from competitors where we see some of these kind of false claims. And so I think as you see these regulations kind of spread out, there will be, potentially more challenges as new actors enter the space. Next slide. And then, one of the main kinds of themes that also, was discussed in the building of this catalog is competition in green procurement, because procurement, as we know, is leveraged as a policy tool to accomplish many goals. And, here we focused on green procurement. Green procurement, sustainable procurement is just one of those goals, but even, these new regulations, they have to be implemented alongside other regulations and domestic laws that we have in place that, sometimes conflict, or sometimes they have to work together. So whether there's Buy American requirements or compliance with our trade obligations under the Trade Agreements Act, how do we make sure that these new regulations are also able to kind of accomplish multiple goals? And one of those big goals is ensuring that any procurement, but certainly green procurement as it's growing, benefits suppliers in the US and the EU, so in the transatlantic marketplace as we're talking about this. So, for green procurement, we often see that there's more sustainable criteria, so it's not going to simply be price-based, but making sure that, you're not awarding green procurement contracts just to the lowest cost or to third country suppliers that may have, unfair competition, and ensuring that if green procurement is a priority, we're driving the creation of those jobs here in the US, in the EU, in GPA countries, to make sure that we are actually competitive in that. And so I think there's competition in procurement is one of the goals that kind of featured heavily, I think, in some of these discussions as well. Next slide. So as part of the TTC, and then also the TIF, USTR and the European Commission, we held many information sessions between government experts on these policies. And I think, some of that cooperation certainly can continue as a lot of these regulations evolve and new ones are kind of put in place, understanding what they mean, how they can be implemented, and understanding how, suppliers on both sides of the transatlantic can benefit from these new regulations. I think one of the most useful things that we did was in January, there was an event for stakeholders. And there was one that was just focused on the role of green procurement in the US and EU, and, challenges that suppliers face in accessing the green procurement marketplace. And I think one of the main things that we heard there certainly was competition from third country suppliers, but also just making sure that there wasn't any greenwashing in procurement, and better understanding the changes in these regulations as they move forward. And then following that, we issued our best practices in April, and certainly this is a document that at some point could be easily updated as these things continue to evolve. Next slide. And all along, our goal has been to take the work that we have done as part of the TTC and the TIST and the creation of this joint catalog, and see if we can also move this to have some kind of multilateral cooperation on green procurement. So I think our first step would be trying to take some of this work and present it and move it into the WTO, the GPA, work program on sustainable procurement. So that includes all GPA parties, and having more countries look at, are they doing the same types of things? Are there things that GPA parties collectively could be doing better, and working on together to have some of these mandates or have some of these policies that look at our same kinds of eco labels that foster trade between each other. And so I think looking at different ways that any of this green procurement can be practiced consistent with our trade obligations in the GPA, I think would be useful for U.S. suppliers and also suppliers in all of those countries.
Thank you very much, Kate. And I want to, based on what you were talking about competition, I want to just ask a quick question again for Gianluigi, because I don't want to put anybody on the spot except for Gianluigi. So Gianluigi, the commission publishes data on the use of competitive dialogue, what we call competitive negotiations under FAR Part 15 in the European Union. And the numbers, when I do it in the United States, in the federal government, 60% of procurement is done using competitive dialogue, competitive negotiations. In the EU, the numbers are so small. When I do the chart, you can't even see the bar. It's tiny. It's like 2% are done using competitive dialogue. Tiny, tiny. If we're going to accommodate green procurement, don't the member states, the procuring entities in member states, have to make broader use of competitive dialogue? Because if they're using open tendering, or we call sealed bidding, essentially they're locking out others who might have good green solutions.
Well, I mean, do you have, I guess we would need another webinar to address your question, but the sort of the easy approach would be the following. Professor Kellman used to call it the fear of discretion, which would explain 80% of the phenomena you've just put on the table. By the way, thank you for having me here, Chris. Very lovely. Thank you. Thank you for letting me share this experience with my distinguished co-panelists. But there is more than the fear of discretion. There is this idea that, at least according to my experience, according to my experience of my colleagues around Europe, competitive dialogue is really something which it should be considered as sort of a last resort measure when the procuring entity does not know exactly what it needs. So it's not considered as a sort of normal way of approaching the market. So this idea of exploring the market, of looking for new solutions, is sort of should be concentrated in the sort of market engagement phase. And I have to say that based on my experience, there are many cases in which when you want to pursue very, even very, I would say, ambitious green objectives, open tenders are enough to accomplish that job. I mean, and I want to mention this at the very final, during the final minute of my contribution. But let me go back, make one step backwards to emphasize two things. So ultimately, the sort of the bundle of strategy you have put on the table at the very beginning of this talk, Chris, can be summarized in two basic concepts. One is regulation and the other is incentives, okay? Regulation is 0-1 approach. You're either in or out. either your, technical specification, the content of a particular harmful, substance complies with a particular rule or not, right? The most, and if we can go to the next slide, I'm gonna make this very short and hopefully clear. Chris, the next slide, please. So regulation is a very dramatic approach. So this is going to have a huge impact on potential competition, because overnight you may find out that some firms would not be able to respond, would not be able to bid. So you may end up with a very peculiar environment in which you have a fewer but better bids. And this is something I've come, sort of an expression, come with my colleague and friend Ariane Reyes, who's the deputy vice minister in the public services ministry in Canada. And so this is not necessarily a bad thing, because it's a way of screening the potential market, right? So there is a price that you have to pay in order to have better bids, which may be to have a lower number of potential bids. So in the short term, this might be an effect of the possible potential level of competition. But at the same time, what is the benefit of this approach is the message becomes very clear. It's either one, you're in or out, okay? And so this sends a signal to firms in terms of making the most appropriate investment so as to be able to bid, say, in the future. The alternative approach would be to establish, and you've mentioned that, Chris, the earlier point in this webinar, the possibility of making a cost and benefit computation in terms, am I going to buy a more expensive green product or green solution? Because sometimes we focus too much on goods, but there are many projects in which the sort of a potential for greener solution is relevant, like energy performance contract for public buildings. Okay, and so when you adopt an incentive approach, you're just saying to the market, "Hey, I'm still willing to trade off, lower costs with higher benefit, and vice versa." And this relates to a question that Sandeep Verma has put, I think the first question we've seen in the chat, which is, how do we measure that trade-off? But that's the point. The point is about the procuring entity's discretion in terms of, which way should I go, okay? So there are some countries in which there is a more dirigistic approach in terms of what economists would call the substitution rate between having a greener product at potentially higher cost rather than the opposite. And in other case, especially in countries where procuring entities have much more higher level of autonomy, they can do whatever they wish. But in doing so, the messages which are sent to the market are less clear, because it all boils down to the procuring entity's preferences. If I'm a procuring entity which a little bit more inclination for a greener product, I'm going to send stronger incentive rather than lower incentives. So the message is weaker, but at the same time, it does not have the sort of dramatic effect of cutting off potentially large number of firms from the market. So which way should we go? That's the important, I would say, ultimately, that's the question. I think that the balanced approach in terms of regulation incentives is the way to go. And let me mention one thing, that is that Italy, for instance, Italy is one of the countries in Europe which adopted a very comprehensive regulatory approach many years ago, starting from regulation, saying basically there are minimum quality standards that have to be met by every and single procuring entity. And if they fail to adopt those standards, the contract is null. So this is a very strong approach, but at the same time, it started many years ago. It has been complemented with an incentive approach, which normally is in the hands of more sophisticated buyers. And Kate was emphasizing, in fact, the importance of having sophisticated or more knowledgeable buyers. And this is why central purchasing organizations, or centralized procurement organization, can play a vital role in sending message, because they bundle needs, because the value of their, say, framework agreement is sizable. They can send very strong signal to the market. And let me mention a second thing about the potential impact of centralized organization. So when it comes to externalities, when we have to measure the societal value of reducing negative externalities, I mean, it's very important that we take into account the value to society and not only the value to a single procured entity, because that would be the first one, would be the most appropriate way of evaluating externalities rather than the second one. This is why having a sort of, at least to some extent, a demand aggregation approach and green public procurement may transform this and may make the entire strategy more effective. Then thirdly, that my last point is about the dialogue between the two sides of the ocean. I mean, the negotiation and reaching an agreement is potentially beneficial because it basically boils down to having similar language. And so we are aiming at having a global market for firms. And then using different standards would be working against that objective. The point is, to me, it's more I would say pragmatical or practical, which is if we rely on eco-labeling or certification schemes, then there is a problem of understanding what is the content of the certification scheme. So in fact, what we need to do is to, at some point, to assess what is the potential impact of using one particular certification scheme than the other. This is why regulation is very important. So I'm going back, as a final comment to your initial questions, Chris. The importance of certification is about predicting the impact. So suppose that tomorrow morning, all of a sudden, overnight, we are forced to buy zero emission vehicles. Right, these would allow us, at least on paper and pencil computation, to predict the likely reduction of CO2 in the atmosphere confined within that particular market. Right, so regulation has the advantage of making those computations possible, whereas a more, I would say, smoother approach, which is an incentive approach, would make that computation a little bit more challenging. So I'm not necessarily advocating, I would say, a dramatic use of regulation. All I'm saying is that both of them are useful. Both of them are complementary tools. The important point is understanding the likely effect of both strategies and how to use them together depending on market readiness, how knowledgeable are public buyers, and what the challenge in terms of objectives at the national or continental level. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you. I've summarized at least 5 slides into 3 comments, for the sake of time.
You're a very good doobie. Thank you, Gianluigi. So that means that we can turn to questions. Is it okay if we turn to the questions, Gianluigi?
I'm perfectly fine.
Thank you for doing that. So this is the question, and I want to go through these questions, and we're going to turn to the audience questions. So one of the things that we had seen over the last few years is that all GPP, all green public procurement, all green procurement solutions are being dealt with equally, that they were just being thrown on the table at the same time. And what we've seen over the last few months, for instance, concerns about the cost of implementing a requirement that vendors track their greenhouse gases, and that is played out not only in the procurement realm but also in the securities regulation realm. We're seeing that some strategies are more implementable than others. So all the panelists, do you see, and does the catalog help in this perhaps, identifying that some strategies should be prioritized over others? Can we see that emerging?
Sorry, was the question for me first? Okay. I mean, to me, this is about the magnitude of impact. We're running out of time. First of all, the magnitude of the challenge is appalling to some extent. We do know that there is a huge potential in public procurement, but at the same time, we're not sure this is the only way the only overall strategy to achieve that outcome. If you look at the 2030 objective in Europe, there are serious doubts that procurement alone can achieve that. Now, the point is, we are pressed to move forward, but at the same time, market is driven by other forces. I mean, investment take time to be put on the ground. And so if you want to push technology if you want to steer technology towards one particular direction, I mean, there is nothing you can do. I mean, overnight, you could use, for instance, what I've just advocated, a lot of regulation. But if the market is not ready, the only effect you're going to have is going to have higher prices. And then this is going to kick back into public finance. And so every public buyer is going to be unhappy because of lack of financial resources. So I guess that it all depends in terms of what particular market we're looking at. So the regulation might be a good way to go, but there are some markets in which regulation may be too dramatic. So I would say that at some point we have to stop, writing down theorems and getting down to particular markets to see what happens. So inevitably, we should look at, let me mention one thing. Every single time we mention the case of CO2, there is one particular positive aspect about CO2. CO2 as a price. Okay, so when you can plug, there are regular auctions in the EU about CO2. So if you're a public buyer, today what's been sort of the average price over the past 12 months. So if you can plug this number into your own computation, you are in a position, at least, theoretically, to make, your appropriate trade-offs in terms of, I'm going to spend a little bit more time to save CO2 by buying a particular product or not. But there are other cases in which there is no price for that particular externality, and so things become inevitably more difficult.
What do you see in terms of the role that trade negotiators might play as a part of the interface between various nations on these issues of identifying the best sustainable strategies?
So I think there's two main roles that we can play in trade negotiations, and there really hasn't been a lot of focus on green procurement in our procurement agreements thus far. But while it's allowed for it in the past, I think trade negotiations in the future can make some of these things mandated. So between partners in negotiations, there must be some kinds of green procurement targets, and there must be kind of a minimum level, certainly for certain sectors or at certain levels of government, generally at the central level. So I think having those types of requirements as part of some of these trade negotiations will help move other countries into, ultimately adopting the same regulations, but then also looking to make sure that we are looking at the same kinds of labels, and a lot of the, green products can be traded between us. I think that those are the main topics that we would see for trade negotiations on green procurement, and then also some of the issues I mentioned previously related to competition in green procurement, to making sure, that there is sustained support for those trade negotiations. Because if we don't have, these kind of very important competitive elements, if those aren't addressed, then that's where we see some of the support for some of these, trade agreements and, negotiations erode.
Well, Chris, if you allow me a few considerations, someone who is part of the EU institution responsible for trade negotiations, I can be perhaps, given the disclaimer you announced at the beginning, I can be probably very candid and bring some sobering remarks, because I think if you were to look reality in the eyes, the reality we see on the ground is a very difficult environment for trade negotiations nowadays. And in our experience, public procurement rules, binding public procurement rules in trade agreements are among the most difficult achievements to get at the end of a very long negotiating process. So as Gianluigi rightly said, we are running out of time. It's one of the worst moments in recent history when it comes to trade negotiations for ambitious rules on public procurement, both at bilateral level in FTA negotiations, but also at the multilateral level. The GPA, if you look at its membership and its track record on green procurement, I think there's room for improvement on both aspects. So all in all, given the fact that we are now in many jurisdictions putting in place new legislative requirements, and rightly so, in order to facilitate, stimulate the green transition, our challenge now is it's a double challenge. On the one hand, we need to negotiate with our own colleagues in our own administrations the kind of rules that will minimize potential trade distortion. The potential for trade distortion is very big when you have an uncoordinated approach and you put in place new legislation. So the very first negotiating challenge for any public procurement official that is responsible for regulatory cooperation or trade negotiations is to negotiate with your own colleagues in your own administration the least trade distorting rules. And that in itself is not easy. And then the second challenge would be to move away perhaps from grand bargains and big trade agreements that take a decade to negotiate and be more pragmatic and perhaps adopt something that is closer to maybe a mini deal, if not a big deal. Mini deals can probably target specific issues and they can create a lot of trade opportunities.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, so I wanted to wrap up with a hard question from Lucian finally, not imposed on Gianluigi. So we got questions from Sandeep Verma, who's a former student of ours, who is actually going to be here in Washington in August. And he's in India. He's in the Indian Administrative Service, and he's very interested in sustainable public procurement issues for India. And he asked whether or not there are objective measures that are available out there, examples of objective measures for green public procurement. And we also got a question about what training might be available. So the hard question I have for you, Lucian, and Caroline Nicholas, who worked with me for 10 years on the UN model procurement law. She's on the call as well. What used to drive me bananas about the UN documents, Caroline, I thought about this. There are no footnotes. There are no footnotes to the UN documents. So you can't know where the information is coming from. Would it be possible in the future to essentially add footnotes to this very useful catalog so that it could be used for training and used for further research in the developing nations as other nations probe and try to understand what's happening both in the U.S. and the European Union? Would that be possible in the future, Lucian?
Allow me to be much more optimistic on this one than on the previous intervention on the fate of trade negotiations and what we can achieve in the short run. Here, I think in the short run, we can achieve a lot more than what in this first version of, this is joint catalog version 1.0. I think we can easily jump to 2.1 or 3.0, whatever technology will allow us to do if we have such great demand and a lot of interest from around the world. I think we have managed recently to put in place in the EU online tools that easify access to procurement knowledge. We have tools that allow any company in the EU to know whether they are eligible or not for a contract in the United States. It's called Access to Procurement. This is my little commercial break moment. Click on the access to procurement on our website and you will see how easy it can be done. I think the green procurement catalog may be easified with a similar approach. The technology is there. You as a user, you define your questions, your training needs, your whatever you want to find out, and then we'll select the right answer from the many pages and many examples in the catalog. You don't have to read all of it. You will just jump to the right paragraph with a footnote attached to it.
Kate?
I would just quickly add on that, I think as we try and bring this work into the GPA, I think the hope is that we would have a similar product that would be, we can make useful to kind of more countries. And so to the extent that there is ways to improve it and, update it, I think, since we've been working on it for a while, we already know ways that certainly I think we could do that and make it useful to other countries. And certainly once it's part of some of the sustainable work program kind of regular work stream, I think we would be focused on training for other countries, looking at how other WTO members could adopt some of these practices and ways we would recommend that they do that.
Thank you very much. It's excellent. All right, with that, we'll wrap up. We're going to try to keep close to our hour schedule. And thank you very much to the panels. This was an extraordinarily productive session. And again, congratulations to the two of you, Luciano and Kate, for a really wonderful catalog. You've moved the discussion forward, and we're very grateful on behalf of the international procurement community. Thanks again. Have a good day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.